On a quiet Sunday morning at exactly 10:38 a.m., Margaret Ellis stood on the front steps of the house she had lived in for 42 years and realized something was terribly wrong. Her key didn't work. She tried again. The key slid into the lock easily, but when she turned it, nothing happened. The mechanism refused to move, like it belonged to another door entirely. Margaret frowned. She had opened this door thousands of times, in rainstorms, after late nights grading papers, carrying groceries, flowers, or her sleeping son when he was small. The key had never failed her. She tried again, still nothing. Then she noticed the small silver sticker near the handle. Guardian Lock Services installed November 8, 3:42 p.m. Margaret slowly lowered her hand. That couldn't be right. She had left town 3 days earlier to help her longtime friend Clara, whose husband had passed away suddenly. When she left, the lock had been the same old brass one her late husband Daniel installed 20 years ago. Now it was brand new. Margaret didn't knock. She didn't panic. Instead, she stepped back from the door and looked at the house. The maple tree in the yard still leaned slightly to the left the way it always had. The blue shutters she painted herself in 1998 were still there. The wind chimes Daniel bought her from a roadside market still hung from the porch. Everything looked the same, except it wasn't. Margaret sat down slowly on the porch steps and folded her hands in her lap. At 67, Margaret Ellis had spent 35 years as a high school principal. She had dealt with angry parents, teenage rebellions, budget crises, and more lies than she could count. She knew when something didn't add up, and right now, nothing added up. She stood again and walked around to the kitchen window. The curtains were half drawn. Inside, she could see movement. Someone was home. Her chest tightened. "Daniel," she whispered automatically before catching herself. Daniel had been gone for 2 years, which meant only one other person had a reason to be inside that house: her son and his wife. Margaret pulled out her phone and called him. The phone rang, once, twice, 3 times, then it went to voicemail. She tried again. This time the call was declined. Margaret stared at the screen for a long moment. Across the street, Mrs. Harper's blinds shifted slightly. Neighbors were watching. Margaret took a deep breath, picked up her suitcase, and walked calmly back to her car. She sat behind the wheel and looked at the house in the rearview mirror. "All right," she murmured softly. "If this is the game you want to play," her voice hardened slightly, "then we're going to play it properly." But what Margaret's son didn't know was that 3 weeks earlier, before she ever left town, she had already discovered what they were planning. And what she did next would change everything. 3 weeks before Margaret Ellis found herself locked out of her own home, she had been standing in the hallway outside the guest bedroom, holding a basket of freshly folded laundry. She hadn't meant to listen, but the door was slightly open, and the voices inside stopped her cold. "It's the easiest way," her daughter-in-law Vanessa was saying. "We just have to be patient." Margaret froze. Her son Brian spoke next. His voice was quieter, hesitant. "I don't know, Vanessa, she's still sharp. Mom notices things." Vanessa laughed softly. "That's the point. We start documenting little incidents." Confusion, forgetfulness. Maybe she leaves the stove on once or twice. "That feels wrong," Brian muttered. Margaret's fingers tightened around the laundry basket. Vanessa's voice turned firm. "Brian, listen to me. Your mother is 67. That house is worth nearly $500,000 now. If we wait until she dies naturally, who knows what happens with taxes, medical bills, or wills?" There was a pause. Then Vanessa said the sentence Margaret would never forget. "If she's declared mentally unfit, you become her legal guardian. The house transfers under your control." The basket slipped slightly in Margaret's hands. Inside the room, Brian exhaled slowly. "She's my mother, Vanessa. And she's living alone in a 5-bedroom house while we're drowning in rent," Vanessa replied sharply. "This is called planning ahead." Margaret quietly backed away from the door. She walked down the hallway, placed the laundry basket on the bed in the guest room, and sat down slowly. Her heart pounded. Not because she was shocked, because she wasn't. For months she had noticed the changes. Vanessa photographing the house for insurance. Vanessa asking strange questions about Margaret's finances. Vanessa insisting on organizing documents and mail. Margaret had been a school principal for 35 years. She recognized manipulation when she saw it. What she hadn't expected was her son staying silent. That night, Margaret barely slept. Instead, she made a decision. The next morning at exactly 9 a.m., Margaret walked into the office of attorney Samuel Carter, an elder law specialist recommended by an old colleague. Samuel Carter was a tall man in his late 50s with silver glasses and the calm patience of someone who had heard every family tragedy imaginable. He listened carefully as Margaret told him everything. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "You'd be surprised how often this happens," he said quietly. Margaret folded her hands. "I'm not surprised at all." Samuel tapped his pen against his desk. "Well, the good news is this: your house is fully paid off and the deed is solely in your name." Margaret nodded. "My husband insisted on that before he passed." "Smart man," Samuel said. Then he leaned forward slightly. "If your son and daughter-in-law attempt guardianship fraud, we can protect you. But the best defense," he smiled faintly, "is preparation." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "What kind of preparation?" Samuel slid a document across the desk. "A family trust." Margaret read the heading slowly. "The Ellis Educational Trust." Her eyes widened slightly. Samuel explained calmly. "If someone tries to take the house from you, they won't get it." Margaret looked up. "Who will?" Samuel smiled. "That part is entirely up to you." Margaret sat quietly for a moment. Then she picked up the pen and signed. But what Brian and Vanessa didn't know was that the house they were trying so hard to steal was no longer hers to give away. And soon, they were going to learn that the hard way. But first, Margaret had to let their plan play out. After signing the trust documents, Margaret Ellis didn't rush home. Instead, she sat in her car outside attorney Samuel Carter's office for nearly 20 minutes, watching the traffic move slowly through the downtown streets. Her hands rested calmly on the steering wheel. Inside, however, her mind was moving quickly. For 35 years as a school principal, Margaret had learned something important about people. When someone believes they're winning, they become careless. And careless people make mistakes. She started the car and drove home. The house greeted her the same way it always had, the quiet creak of the porch steps, the wind chimes singing softly, the smell of lemon cleaner she used every Saturday morning. For a moment, Margaret allowed herself to feel the weight of what she'd heard. Her own son. The boy she had raised after Daniel died. The boy whose scraped knees she'd bandaged, whose homework she'd checked, whose college tuition she'd worked extra years to help pay. Now planning to take her home, Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "All right," she whispered to the empty kitchen. "If that's how this story is going to go," she poured herself a cup of tea. "Then I'll write the ending." Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret did something surprising. She acted exactly the same. She cooked dinner. She asked Brian about work. She even listened politely when Vanessa talked about her new wellness consulting business. But she also watched. And the more she watched, the clearer their plan became. Vanessa had started asking strange questions. "Margaret, have you ever forgotten where you put your keys? Do you ever get confused driving at night? Have you thought about assisted living communities? Some of them are really lovely." Margaret simply smiled and answered gently. "No, dear, I'm doing just fine." Meanwhile, Brian seemed nervous around her. Sometimes Margaret would catch him staring at her like he was trying to measure something. Her memory, her awareness, her weakness. One evening at dinner, Vanessa casually placed her phone on the table. Margaret noticed the camera lens pointing toward her. Recording. Margaret pretended not to notice. Instead, she picked up her fork and asked Brian about the basketball team he used to coach. Vanessa's phone slowly lowered. No confusion, no mistakes, no evidence. Margaret kept everything perfectly ordinary, until one afternoon. Vanessa approached her with a sympathetic smile. "Margaret, you've been doing so much lately. Helping friends, volunteering, gardening, you must be exhausted." Margaret stirred her tea slowly. "Oh, I manage." Vanessa tilted her head. "You know, Brian and I could take care of the house for a few days if you ever needed a break." Margaret looked up. "A break?" "Yes," Vanessa said warmly. "Just a little trip. Visit a friend, relax." Margaret studied her carefully. And suddenly the pieces clicked together. They needed her gone just long enough. Margaret smiled softly. "Well, actually, Vanessa leaned forward slightly. Yes, I was thinking about visiting my friend Clara next week. Her husband just passed away. She could use the company. Vanessa's eyes lit up for a split second before she hit it. That's such a kind thing to do. Margaret nodded gently. I'll probably stay a few days. Brian looked up from his plate, clearly surprised. You will? Yes, Margaret said calmly. Across the table, Vanessa's smile widened. And in that moment, Margaret understood something very clearly. They thought the plan was theirs. But the truth was, Margaret had just given them exactly the opportunity they were waiting for. Because sometimes the smartest move in a battle is letting your opponent believe they've already won. But what Brian and Vanessa didn't realize was that the moment Margaret drove away from the house, their trap was already closing around them, and they wouldn't see it coming. The morning Margaret Ellis left for Clara's house began like any other. The sun rose slowly over Maple Street, spilling warm light across the front yard. The maple tree in the corner swayed gently in the breeze, and the familiar wind chimes chimed softly above the porch. Margaret stood in the kitchen making coffee. Across the room, Vanessa sat at the table scrolling through her phone, pretending to be uninterested. Brian was leaning against the counter, watching quietly. Margaret noticed everything. The glances they exchanged, the quiet tension in the air, the strange anticipation neither of them could hide. She poured the coffee into her favorite mug and took a sip. I'll probably be back Sunday morning, she said casually. Vanessa looked up immediately. That soon? Margaret smiled. Well, Clara will need space eventually. Grief is a private thing. Brian nodded slowly. Of course, Mom. Margaret finished packing her overnight bag after breakfast. Just a few essentials. Clothes, toiletries, and a small leather folder she slipped carefully into the side pocket. Before leaving, she walked slowly through the house. The living room. The hallway where Brian used to mark his height on the wall as a child. The kitchen where she and Daniel had danced once while dinner burned on the stove. 42 years of memories lived in those walls. And Margaret knew something her son didn't. This house wasn't just a building. It was proof. Proof of everything she and Daniel had built together. When she reached the front door, Vanessa appeared beside her. We'll take good care of everything while you're gone, she said sweetly. Margaret turned the knob and stepped outside. I'm sure you will. Brian carried her bag to the car. As he placed it in the trunk, he hesitated. You sure you'll be okay driving that far? Margaret smiled gently. Brian, I drove teenagers to state competitions for 25 years. I think I can manage a 2-hour drive. He forced a small laugh. Right. Margaret got into the driver's seat. As she started the car, she glanced at the house one last time. Vanessa was standing in the kitchen window watching her. Smiling, Margaret waved. Vanessa waved back, and then Margaret drove away. But what Brian and Vanessa didn't know was that Margaret didn't drive directly to Clara's house. Instead, halfway there, she pulled into a quiet parking lot beside a small community library. She turned off the engine and pulled out her phone. There were 3 unread messages from attorney Samuel Carter. The first read, Trust finalized this morning. The second, property officially transferred to Ellis Educational Trust. The third message made Margaret smile. Everything is legally protected now. No one can claim. Margaret returned to Maple Street 3 days later. The drive home had been quiet. Clara had tried to convince her to stay longer, but Margaret politely declined. She had already done what she needed to do. Now it was time to see how far Brian and Vanessa had gone. When she turned onto her street, everything looked normal. The same houses, the same sidewalks, Mrs. Harper watering her roses across the road. Margaret parked her car slowly in front of her house. For a moment, she simply sat there, staring at it. 42 years. That house had watched her raise a child, bury a husband, celebrate birthdays, and cry through losses. Now someone inside believed it belonged to them. Margaret stepped out of the car and walked up the porch steps. She placed the key into the lock. It didn't turn. She tried again, still nothing. That was when she noticed the new lock and the small silver sticker. Guardian Lock Services. Installed Friday. Margaret exhaled slowly. So they had done it. They had actually gone through with it. She rang the doorbell once. No answer. But through the curtains she could see movement. They were home. They were simply pretending she wasn't. Margaret stood there for a few seconds longer. Then she turned around calmly and walked back to her car. Instead of driving away, she parked 2 houses down beneath a large oak tree. From there she had a clear view of the front porch. An hour passed, then 2. At around 4:30 in the afternoon, the front door opened. Vanessa stepped outside holding a coffee mug. Margaret watched carefully. Vanessa stood on the porch, looked around slowly, and smiled to herself. Not the polite smile Margaret had seen for years. This was different. This was the smile of someone who believed they had already won. Vanessa took a sip of coffee and walked back inside. Margaret sat very still in the driver's seat. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Brian. "Mom, saw your calls." "Everything okay?" Margaret stared at the message. "Everything okay?" she typed slowly. "I'm at the house. The locks are changed." 3 dots appeared on the screen, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, Brian replied. "Oh, wow. Vanessa must have done that after a break-in scare. I'll get you a key tomorrow." Margaret leaned back in her seat. A break-in scare. Interesting. She didn't reply. Instead, she turned off her phone and looked back at the house. Night slowly fell over the neighborhood. Streetlights flickered on. The temperature dropped. Margaret wrapped a small blanket from the trunk around her shoulders. At 67, sleeping in a car was not comfortable, but she stayed. Because Margaret wanted to understand something. She wanted to see just how comfortable they were living inside a house they believed they had taken. Around midnight, the kitchen light turned off. The house went dark. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Then she whispered softly into the quiet car. "You should have known better, Brian." Because what he didn't realize was that the moment he changed those locks, he had just created the exact evidence Margaret needed. And in the morning, she was going to take her house back. But she wasn't going to do it alone. At 6 o'clock sharp, Margaret picked up her phone and called someone she hadn't spoken to in months. A man who had been her husband's closest friend for 40 years. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Peterson Hardware and Locksmith, Frank speaking." Margaret smiled faintly. "Frank, it's Margaret Ellis." There was a pause. Then Frank said something that made her realize help was already on the way. "Margaret, tell me what they did." And 30 minutes later, a white locksmith van was already driving toward Maple Street. But when Brian and Vanessa woke up that morning, they were about to discover something terrifying. Because the woman they believed they had locked out was about to walk right back in. At exactly 6:42 a.m., a white van pulled slowly onto Maple Street. Margaret was still sitting in her car 2 houses down when she saw it. The familiar blue lettering on the side read, "Peterson Hardware and Locksmith." The van parked in front of her house. A tall, older man stepped out, stretching his back before grabbing a metal toolbox from the passenger seat. Frank Peterson looked older than the last time Margaret had seen him. His hair had turned almost completely gray, and his movements were slower than they once were. But his eyes were the same, sharp, steady. And when he spotted Margaret walking toward him, they softened immediately. "Margaret," he said quietly. "Frank." They stood there for a moment. Frank had known her husband Daniel for nearly 40 years. The 2 men had built half the fences in the neighborhood together and spent countless weekends fixing things for neighbors who couldn't afford repairs. Frank glanced at the front door. "They really did it, huh?" Margaret nodded. "Friday afternoon." Frank shook his head slowly. "Daniel would be furious." Margaret gave a small smile. "Yes, he would." Frank picked up his toolbox. "Well," he said, walking toward the porch, "let's fix that." Margaret followed him up the steps. Frank examined the new lock carefully. "Cheap install," he muttered. "They didn't even reinforce the strike plate." Margaret leaned against the porch railing. Inside the house, she could hear faint movement. Someone was awake. Frank pulled out a set of tools and began working. Metal clicked softly against metal. "New deadbolt will take me about 15 minutes, he said. Margaret nodded. "Take your time." Inside the house, footsteps approached the door. The handle turned suddenly. The door opened halfway. Vanessa stood there in workout clothes, holding a phone. Her expression froze the moment she saw Margaret. "What are you doing here?" Frank didn't even look up. "Morning," he said casually while continuing to work. Vanessa's eyes moved from Margaret to the locksmith tools. "What is this?" Margaret answered calmly. I'm changing the locks on my house. Vanessa's face tightened. You can't do that. Frank finally glanced up. Ma'am, he said politely, the property owner requested the service. Vanessa crossed her arms. We live here. Margaret met her eyes. No, she said evenly. You were staying here temporarily. Behind Vanessa, Brian suddenly appeared in the hallway. His face went pale when he saw Margaret standing on the porch. Mom! Margaret didn't raise her voice. Good morning, Brian. He stepped forward slowly. What's going on? Frank tightened the final screw on the new deadbolt. Then he stood up and handed Margaret 2 brass keys. Try. Brian stood frozen in the middle of the living room. Vanessa looked from Margaret to the folder in her hands, then back again. You're bluffing, Vanessa said sharply. Margaret didn't react. Instead, she walked calmly to the kitchen table and placed the folder down. The same kitchen table where Brian had done homework as a boy. The same table where Daniel used to read the newspaper every Sunday morning. Margaret opened the folder slowly. These, she said, sliding the papers forward, are legal documents filed 3 weeks ago. Brian stepped closer. Vanessa grabbed the top page and scanned it quickly. At first her expression was confident, then confusion crept in, then panic. What is this? She demanded. Margaret folded her hands. It's a trust agreement. Brian frowned. A trust? Yes. Margaret looked directly at him. The Ellis Educational Trust. Vanessa shook her head. That doesn't mean anything. Margaret's voice remained calm. It means the house no longer belongs to me. Brian blinked. What? Margaret tapped the document. As of 3 weeks ago, this property was transferred into a charitable trust. Vanessa laughed nervously. You're lying. Margaret turned the page toward them. There it was, signed, filed, notarized. Brian's voice dropped to a whisper. You gave the house away, Margaret nodded. When I pass away, the property will be sold. The money will fund college scholarships for students in this neighborhood. Vanessa's face turned pale. That's insane. No, Margaret replied quietly. What's insane is trying to steal something that was never yours. The room fell silent. Brian ran a hand through his hair. Mom, why would you do that? Margaret looked at him carefully. Because 3 weeks ago I overheard a conversation. Brian's eyes widened. Vanessa froze. Margaret continued calmly. You were discussing guardianship, declaring me mentally unfit, taking control of my home. Brian's face drained of color. Mom, Margaret raised her hand. Don't lie. Vanessa tried to recover. That was just a conversation. People plan for the future. Margaret looked directly at her. You also contacted 2 assisted living facilities and an elder law firm asking about guardianship timelines. Vanessa's mouth fell open. How do you know that? Margaret smiled faintly. Because my lawyer obtained copies of those inquiries. Brian stared at the papers on the table. So, the house, Margaret nodded, is legally protected. Vanessa's voice rose. You did this out of spite. Margaret shook her head slowly. No, she gestured around the room. I did it because this house was built with love, not greed. Brian's voice cracked. So we get nothing. Margaret studied him quietly. Then she said something that hit even harder. That depends. Vanessa frowned. What does that mean? Margaret closed the folder. The trust has one condition. Brian looked up. What condition? Margaret's voice softened slightly. If my relationship with my son is repaired in a meaningful and respectful way, she paused. The trust allows the property to transfer to him. Brian's eyes widened. You mean? But, Margaret continued firmly, that decision will be evaluated 5 years after my death by the trust board. Vanessa slammed her hand on the table. This is ridiculous. Margaret stood up. No, she said calmly. What's ridiculous is believing you could erase me from my own life. Brian looked around the room slowly. For the first time, he seemed to understand the full weight of what had happened. The plan, the lies, the betrayal, and the consequences. Margaret walked toward the front door and opened it. You have 10 minutes left. Vanessa grabbed her bag angrily. This isn't over. Margaret didn't respond. But as Brian stood there silently, staring at the floor, Margaret realized something. For the first time since she returned home, her son looked genuinely afraid. Not of losing the house, but of losing something far worse. Because the one thing Brian hadn't realized until now was that money could be replaced. But trust, once broken, might never come back. And the next choice he made would decide whether he lost his mother forever. The house was quiet again. For the first time in weeks, Margaret Ellis could hear the familiar sounds she loved: the faint creak of the floorboards, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the wind chimes outside tapping gently in the breeze. Brian and Vanessa's car had disappeared down the street nearly an hour earlier. Margaret stood in the living room, looking around slowly. Their things were gone, but traces of them remained. A lavender candle still burned faintly on the coffee table. Vanessa's minimalist decorations were still on the shelves. The furniture had been rearranged into a layout that felt unfamiliar and cold. Margaret walked over and picked up the candle. She blew it out. The scent faded slowly into the air. Then she began to move through the house. Not quickly, carefully, like someone reclaiming something that had almost been lost. In the bedroom, she opened the closet where Vanessa had packed several boxes labeled "Donate." Margaret opened the top one. Inside were her photo albums. The first album held pictures from 1982. Brian at 3 years old, Daniel holding him on his shoulders in the backyard. Margaret traced the photo with her finger. "So small," she whispered. She closed the album gently and carried the box back to the living room. Piece by piece, she returned things to where they belonged. Her books back on the shelves, her photos back on the sideboard. Daniel's old armchair rolled out of the garage and placed beside the window where it had always been. By afternoon, the house began to feel like itself again. Margaret made a cup of tea and sat down in the armchair. The same chair Daniel had loved. The same chair Vanessa had called bad energy. Margaret smiled faintly at the thought. Outside, Mrs. Harper walked past and waved through the window. Margaret raised her cup in greeting. News traveled fast in neighborhoods like this. Everyone had seen the moving car. Everyone had heard the raised voices earlier that morning, but Margaret didn't feel embarrassed. If anything, she felt lighter. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message from Brian. She stared at it for a moment before opening it. "Mom, I'm sorry." Margaret didn't respond. Another message appeared. "I know sorry isn't enough." Then another. "I don't know how I became someone who could hurt you like that."